the incoming head of the Reuters Institute of Journalism. Rasmus, where do you see journalism today?
I mean, in some ways, journalism has a timeless mission, right? It's about providing people with information that empower them to drive the change they want to see in the world. I mean, this is a mission that almost any journalist I know would subscribe to. Whether they are allowed to pursue it or not is a different matter. And I think there are a number of challenges right now in terms of journalists being allowed to pursue this mission of empowering other people. Some of them are external, so we see in many parts of the world what I think of as an outright war on journalism. There are powerful forces, many of them politicians, some of them democratically elected, but also others that don't like the idea of independent media, don't like the idea of journalism, and are cracking down on it. This is a huge challenge. There is the challenge of the business models based around print and broadcast in a world where audiences and advertisers are voting with their feet and moving somewhere else. These business models will not sustain professional journalism indefinitely. We need to find new business models that can ensure editorial independence by making sure that news organizations can be profitable, or at least sustain themselves. And finally, there is the role of platform companies that are at the same time providing incredible opportunities for people, first and foremost, but also for journalists to share information, create communities, and navigate the world. But of course, also many challenges, as we've seen very powerfully in recent years, with disinformation campaigns, with manipulation, with trolling and hate speech proliferating on some of these, in particular on social media platforms, but also video sharing sites and the like. I think these are some of the external challenges journalism faces. There are also some internal ones where I think the profession and the industry needs to look in the mirror and answer some questions about where journalism has sort of brought itself to, if you will. So I think there is the question of trust. Why is it that in much of the world, a majority of the population say they do not feel they can trust most of the media most of the time? That's a huge issue. If you believe that your mission is to empower people, if they don't trust you, that should create an occasion for reflection, if you will. There is the issue of change. Many journalists and many news organizations are understandably proud of what they did in the 20th century, but are struggling with how they can reinvent what they do for the 21st century. And if they don't manage to do that, they will become relics of the past, and that is a sad place to end up. And finally, I think there is a very fundamental existential question about what journalism is for. Like, what is the way in which journalism ensures that it actually empowers people in the world when people clearly do not actually always accept that this is what journalism does. So how does journalists convince the public that they do the work for them, and that the public should support and embrace and engage with journalism the way that journalism seeks to engage with the public?
And what path do you see going forward? Where are things going in terms of your view?
I think the best journalism today in many parts of the world is better than it's ever been. I mean, I'm a white man, so I realize this will sound sort of slightly ironic or perverse coming from me, but we have to confront the fact that a lot of journalism historically has been by white men, about white men, and for white men. And it's clear that journalism in the 20th century has much to be proud of, but also many reasons to very critically inspect its own record and think about whether it engaged in ways that were truthful and honest and constructive on many issues that are about diversity, of gender, of sexuality, political orientation, religion, and many other issues. This is not only about progressive values. There are also many parts of the world in which journalism has been very poor at dealing with religion, for example, and religious experience is taken seriously, that religion is an incredibly important and powerful part of many people's lives and not some holdover from some dark Middle Ages.
Right.
So I think journalism has a lot of questions to ask of itself, but I would say I think we see today some of the best forms of journalism, I would say, are more informative than it ever was in the past. It's more accessible than it ever was in the past. You can access it from anywhere with a phone if you are privileged enough to have a smartphone, which increasingly a large part of the world's population is. It's more participatory and interactive. It has a different and more small d democratic relationship with its readers. It's less the sort of we print and you read, or we broadcast and you watch. It's more about a mutual relationship. It's very far from as diverse as the societies that it aims to serve, but it's more diverse than it used to be in some ways. In other ways, perhaps sometimes less diverse than in the past, in particular in terms of class, for example. But there's been progress in some areas. It's also, I think, more because of the challenges it faces. It's become more honest about its place in the world, and with that honesty has come, I think, a humility that is, in some ways, I think, a healthier place to be. I think most journalists have always embraced the idea that in reality journalism was an imperfect craft. You did your honest best, you tried, there were lots of obstacles, it's hard to make sense of the world in real time, but you tried and you put it out there. But I think the way it often came across and was presented to the reader was sort of a, we have the truth and you don't. And it's very clear now to anyone who is not asleep at the wheel that this is not the world we live in anymore. And I think that realization that the mentality of sort of we have the truth and you don't is not going to work in a world in which many people don't trust journalism, in a world in which journalists often face the challenge that, they don't always have the expertise and insight to instantaneously make sense of complex problems in real time, which is a huge challenge, and thus sometimes they make mistakes. But they can fess up to those mistakes, and they can have a healthier relationship with the public that help inform their reporting and help make sure that important information reaches people in a timely way.
On October 1, Rasmus, you're going to be taking over the Reuters Institute of Journalism at Oxford University. You are in your mid-30s. There's this transition also to a young, different view of journalism and the world, right? What's important to you when you come in?
I think there are some parts of journalism that truly are timeless and where the mission and the principles are enduring. The aspiration to find truth and report it. I mean, that the first commitment of journalism is to the best obtainable version of the truth. I think that's a timeless commitment. And I realize that many journalists are not privileged enough to work in organizations where they can actually do it, but they often want to. And I don't think that's going to change. I think that's a very important commitment for journalists. I also think that journalists understand well that even in matters of fact, the truth is a tricky business. And you also always have to make a judgment, an editorial judgment, a judgment about who you are for and what you're trying to accomplish that will be part of how you tell a story and how you try to engage with your public. So these are things are enduring for journalism, and I think are at least as important for my generation as they are for other generations, in part because they are so challenged now that not so long ago, perhaps we could assume that these were articles of faith that everyone subscribed to. It is very visibly not the case anymore, and in that sense, I think there is a certain rallying around the flag of these principles and these values. I would also say I think that everyone from my generation, and certainly everyone younger than me, are fully and enthusiastically embrace the idea that the future of the media is digital media, it's mobile media, and it's a media environment where platform companies play a very large role. And those companies are powerful and profitable, and they are highly imperfect, and they are not always conscious enough of their public responsibilities, though they are trying to up their game. I think we will see a very painful and often destructive few years ahead of us before that is sorted out. I mean, there's a lot to fix. But I would say this, that I'm just old enough to remember a world in which, even in a very privileged country like Denmark, where I'm from, the media meant that you had access to one state-controlled public service broadcaster that broadcasted for about 12 hours a day on TV, a couple of radio stations, a regional newspaper, and a couple of daily newspapers. And if I wanted to read anything else, even just a regional newspaper from another part of Denmark, I would have to literally go to Copenhagen, on a train to the central station, which was the only place I could get, say, international newspapers or just newspapers from other parts of the country. And that environment had many virtues, and in some ways it served my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation well. But I can just say this, I don't miss it. And I don't know anyone under 40 who would want to return to that media environment. And I say that without any condescension towards the values of the journalists who operate in that environment. And I understand the longing for the certainties that came with that, and the privileges for some that came with that, for journalists in terms of the power, the profitability, the security, the career progression, so on and so forth, and the principles that informed that journalism. But I would say that in most ways, it seems that the majority of the world's population, on the balance, are voting with their attention, with their feet, so to speak, and embracing digital media, and feel that this is a better environment. And I'm very glad to see that journalists all over the world, and editors and executives in news organizations all over the world, are not only begrudgingly accepting that this is where the public is, and if you want to serve the public, you have to be with it, but are embracing it enthusiastically. And I think doing things that, and this is without in any way trivializing the many, many challenges journalists face all over the world, and all the ways in which digital technology has made journalism harder for some, including at a very personal level with trolling and the like, that they also enable a journalism that is better than the one I grew up with.
Fantastic. Great.